Casual Birder podcast, a weekly podcast for people interested in the birds they find around them. I'm Suzy Buttress. I'm attending the London Podcast Festival at King's Place in London. It's been a wonderful few days of live podcasts, seen some amazing shows. I've attended a few panels and workshops, and I've done some interviews for the Casual Birder podcast too. And you can listen to those episodes coming out in the next few weeks. So I wanted to let you know that today's episode is going to be quite different. It's just going to be a short update on what I've been doing, and I'd like to share some feedback from listeners with you. So just to let you know, in case you hear any bird calls in the background, I'm sitting by Regent's Canal. It's a bit of a breezy day, so I'm hoping that I'm protecting the mic from the wind. I've got some coots next to me in Regent's Canal. And you'll remember that coots are a black water bird with a white faceplate and white beak. And they are weed eaters, and they are currently going along the side of some rather colourful canal barges and gathering bits of pondweed that they're finding and eating those. But they are occasionally calling out, so... And I think you'll hear in the background there is a crow. Which reminds me, I need to apologise for something that I said last week. In last week's episode, I did a bird walk in Regent's Park, and I mentioned that I was seeing lots of juvenile rooks around. So the birds that I saw there were grouped together. There were about 7 or 8 of them. They had blackish plumage but with a lot of brown feathers on them, indicating that they were juveniles. And to be fair, they didn't have white faces like adult rooks have, but I've had juvenile rooks in my garden and they also don't have white faces. They actually look very similar to carrion crows. I'd always understood carrion crows to be quite solitary, that you might see them in 1s or 2s, which led me to the assumption that I was seeing juvenile rooks in Regent's Park. Now, I'm always open to being corrected, and in the week I met up with Dusty Gedge, who is a very keen birder and an expert in creating green roofs. And I was interviewing Dusty about both his love of birds and the work that he does creating these green roofs. And he let me know that he was very familiar with the birds in Regent's Park and rooks aren't found there. He was a bit hesitant about letting me know that, but I'm very open to being corrected. As I've told you before, I work from my own experience. I do try to check whether the birds I'm seeing are the right ones, but sometimes it's possible to make errors. I allowed the fact that I felt I was very familiar with these birds to stop me actually checking while I was there looking at them. So I didn't bother to check whether they were crows or rooks. I made the assumption that they were juveniles, and they were, but I made the assumption that because there was a group of them, that they were rooks. I was very pleased that Dusty was able to point out my mistake, and I went back to Regent's Park this week and went to see the birds again and took some more photographs and observed them more closely. And yes, they were carrion crows. So I'm issuing an apology now that last week's episode referred to them as juvenile rooks. They weren't. They were juvenile carrion crows. But it's a good lesson to not make assumptions. There are obviously birds that I know the plumage very, very well, but with something where the birds can be confused, I'm going to make sure that I look them up and try to get them right, because I don't want to mislead people. Also during the week, I had some queries about feeding garden birds. My colleague at work, Hannah, has recently been given a lovely little feeder, a decorative feeder, which she actually is going to be able to use, which is in the shape of a teacup. And she had asked me a few weeks ago about how to hang that up in the garden and what food to use in it. So I advised her to get some sunflower hearts, which are the insides of sunflower seeds, but they're a no mess seed, so she wouldn't have shells left all over the floor. And she had put those out with the teacup, but she hadn't had any birds visiting. And so she did ask me why was that. She was very disappointed because obviously she's had this lovely feeder, filled it up with the seed, put it out and waited a few days and nothing came to eat from it. So I asked her a few questions about where she was siting the feeder, and she said that she has a garden with decking and she's starting to plant it up, but she had put the feeder close to the house where she could see it. A couple of things to think about when you're putting feeders out for the first time. Birds need to know that there's food around, and if you haven't been feeding up to that point, they may not be aware that you're suddenly feeding. They don't know that you've put a feeder out. Also, if you site the feeder near an area where there's no vegetation, no grass or no bushes, they're not necessarily going to have a reason to come close to that area to look for food. So I advised her to move the feeder closer to some shrubs to start with, to get the birds used to knowing that there's food there. I also advised her to put some water out, even if it's just in a plant dish. You can get quite large plant dishes that are shallow, plastic. That sound was the sound of a coot. Oh, two coots. Just suddenly taking off. How they take off is to run along the water and gain some height and speed that way. So I advised her to put some water out as well, because that's useful for all animals that might come to the garden. But having a wide shallow dish will provide, and keeping it topped up with clean water will help provide places for bathing and drinking, and that will bring birds in as well. The other thing I advised her to do was just to put a few seeds down at ground level. So the sorts of birds that will eat seeds out of a teacup are blue tits, great tits. In my garden, I have robins taking the food from feeders, and blackbirds have even done it in my garden, but that's not something that they would do straight away. You're more likely to get the tit type birds coming to the feeder, but you need them to know that there's food in the garden. So providing water is a good tip. The other thing I said to her to do was to keep an eye on the weather, because as she's got a teacup, so it's a bowl shaped feeder, if it rains or gets damp, that food is just going to be sitting there in water and it won't last, it will go mouldy. So if you have birds that don't yet know you're providing food and you just leave food out to get mouldy, that's not a great situation. So I did advise her to keep an eye on that. So anyway, I've asked Hannah to try some of the tips that I gave her, to put some water out, to move the feeder closer to some vegetation so that they get used to knowing that that particular feeder has food in it, and to put a small amount of food at ground level for things like blackbirds, robins, dunnocks. So at least there's some food around. I hope you can hear this. There's some lovely little peeps going past. Let's just see if you can hear it. So an adult swan, an adult mute swan, and 4 cygnets have just swum by. And the youngsters are almost the same height as the adult now, but they're still in a sort of grey-brown plumage. But they have a very delicate little peep, 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 like tiny little chicks, and yet they're large birds, so it's quite interesting to see the difference. So I've asked Hannah to report back and to be patient, because it can take up to 2 weeks for birds to find that you have seed in the garden. And I know it is disappointing when you first put feeders out and hope to see a wide variety of birds straight away. But if the ground birds come along and take some of the seed on the floor, any birds flying over will see that there's potentially other birds on the floor congregating, and that will attract more birds in of different species. So I'm hoping that next week we'll have an update from Hannah to say that she's had the birds visiting her teacup. Once she's had them visiting for a while, she can put it back in the site that she wants to see it from. I've also had an email this week from Kay, and Kay was asking about putting suet out for birds. She also had put suet out for the birds in her garden, but hadn't had any birds eating it. So again, I gave Kay some of the same information about where is the suet sited. Is it close to the house? Is it somewhere that's near vegetation, near cover? So once again, I suggested that she checks the feeder to make sure that the suet hadn't gone mouldy if it had been out for a long period. And if it was all looking okay still, to just consider moving the feeder a little bit closer to some vegetation for a short period, just to allow the birds to understand that there's food around and get familiar with that. I've also suggested that Kay provides water. It's always useful to have water in the garden, especially as we're now going into the autumn and winter. They will need it just as much as they do in the summer, and it's useful for bathing, and it will bring birds in once they know there's regular water. In fact, even if you only had water in the garden and no food, it would still encourage birds to come in. Okay, so I'm going to have to finish now because I'm going to my first show of the day. I'm really looking forward to today. There's so much. I'm meeting lots of people, lots of other podcasters, other fans of the Maximum Fun podcasts that I've mentioned before. And it's just really, really wonderful here at King's Place. If you ever get the chance to come to future podcast festivals, I highly recommend it. And if you're not in London or you can't get to London, have a look for your own local cities. Podcast festivals are more and more frequent now, and it's a real great opportunity to hear about new podcasts and actually see them performed live, and it's very exciting. And podcasters are a nice bunch, and they'll very often talk to you too. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I'm sorry it's a short episode this week. I've got lots of material, lots of interviews to share with you, and in the coming weeks I've got some really exciting ones coming out. So hope you'll forgive me for having a short episode this week, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye everyone. Thank you to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by the Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. And check out their website at www.dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast.